Hey everyone, Steven here, and welcome to my little library of horrors. Well, summer's winding down, and for me that means back to some normalcy in my house. Kids are back in school, so that gives me a little more free time during the day. With the summer, it's really hard for me to get any reading in at all, just because I'm constantly so busy. But that doesn't mean I didn't read anything this summer. As a matter of fact, the book I read actually happens to take place over the summer. And, it really added a level of immersion while I was reading, as the dates in the book were lining up with the dates in real life. So it definitely, like I said, gave this nice level of immersion while I was reading it. And that book is called The Ceremonies by T.E.D Klein. Cover's a little beat up, but that's pretty typical with these shiny covers. The foil starts to peel off of them after a while. If you look closely, you can actually see the little snake head here, or beast head there. The Ceremonies is a book I've had for quite a while now in my collection, and it's a book that was something I never planned on really getting around to, but is also one that I always stopped and looked at whenever I was rearranging or happened to be, passing through my shelves or something. Funnily enough, because it kind of reminds me of the story from my childhood, the night I got lost in Witch Woods, which is a whole long story within itself. And I don't want this video to be an hour long, but I'll tell you what, if we can get this video to 20 likes, I will drop a video telling the story of the night I got lost in Witch Woods in the 6th grade. If you want to see that, please drop a like on the video. And let's get into the review. So, Ceremonies begins with a little boy wandering the woods, and he's trying out some new snowshoes. And I believe the year is very early 1900s, if not very late 1800s. But anyway, he's walking through the woods when he comes across this tree. And for some reason, this tree is alive, and there's a beast within the tree that starts to communicate with him. And so, every day he goes back to the tree, and they have more and more conversations until the tree convinces him that he is basically this instrument needed for the beast to be reincarnated to make him a god, essentially. That's pretty much the prologue. And then as we get to the main story, we get introduced to our first character, Jeremy Freirs. Jeremy is he's a man in his late 20s, unless early 30s, I think, actually. I think he's 30, 31, I think. But anyway, he lives in New York City. He's a college professor and is starting to make this huge lesson plan on the history of horror, which is a big theme within the story of itself. It's kind of a big love letter to horror of the past, which is funny, seeing as how this book was published in... It was originally a short story that was published in 1974. It was in the year's best horror stories, number 2. Under the title The Events at Porth Farm. But this became a full-fledged novel in 1984. And it's funny to see the main character sort of pine over how horror has sort of seemed to lost its luster in being too fast-paced compared to what it used to be, back in Poe's era and stuff like that. And it's just sort of funny because I sort of feel that same way with today's horror. I feel it's much too fast-paced and focuses too heavily on shock factor over building tension. And I think the 80s was peak horror literature. So it's funny to see an author in the 80s say that their stuff is not as good as it used to be back in, the early 1900s. But anyway... Jeremy comes across an ad in the paper that, offers a place to stay, peace and quiet on a farmland. And that's what he's looking for in order to concentrate on his lesson plan. He feels that some time away from the city and in the peace and quiet of, the countryside will help him. And so he goes, and that brings us to one of my biggest praises of the book is the prose. Klein's writing is simply hypnotic, if I'm going to be honest. Like, the way he writes is very smooth. It's simple, but very detailed in a way that engages you without throwing complicated words and complex prose. So there's this scene when Jeremy first gets to Gilead where he is waiting for the bus to come to take him to the farm, and he's sort of just, scoping out this graveyard, and he decides to lay down and just kind of hang out. And the way Klein describes the day, the setting, and sort of how Jeremy's lulling into a nap, it made my eyelids start to droop. Like, I was honestly like, oh wow, this is great. It's so immersive. And it's like that throughout the book. Like, he really brings you into the mindset of the characters and what's going on during the scene. And I love that with any book. When an author can put me in the mindset of their characters and make me feel what they're feeling, like, not even so much like terror or excitement, like being tired, that's simply amazing to me. But anyway, as Jeremy finally gets to the farm, that's when we get introduced to our next set of characters, the Porths. So Gilead is sort of this almost Amish community where, they're very old school, very religious. And the Porths are sort of, they're incredibly interesting characters because they're sort of almost an outcast within the community because they're like one of the few people that use electricity and they weren't born with, well, let me explain. So it's Sar and Deborah Porth. So Sar is this very stoic, heavily religious man that was born in Gilead, but had moved to New York to go to college and things like that. He sort of started to question his faith and things like that. And then that's where he met his wife, Deborah. And again, Deborah was also someone that is someone who was not born within that community. So she's not as heavily religious as Sar and the rest of the community. But regardless, she marries Sar and they move back there and things like that. So, that makes them in and of themselves sort of an outcast within the community. But there's such the very beginning, like, you had, like, the author straight off the bat makes you feel like they are antagonists. It's just the way at least Sar's presented. Like I said, he's very stoic, very silent. But then you have Deborah, who's very playful, if you know what I mean. She's very flirtatious, very extroverted, but not in a way that makes her, like a scummy person, if that makes any sense. I think it adds, like, it's a nice contrast, obviously, to Sar's personality, but I think adds also a nice contrast to the overall story. It's very heavy with, other themes that are not so fun. She adds sort of this brightness to the story that really makes the story fun. So yeah, as they're introduced, like I said, we get this feeling of them that they're antagonists, but as the story goes on, we start to see that that's not the case at all. And it's just this another really nice point of the story is characters. A lot of characters have this really nice arc throughout the story. Not all of them, but a lot of them do have a very interesting arc throughout the story. And it's just a lot of fun to see how they evolve throughout. So then we get sort of our next character introduced, Carol. So Carol is she's a woman in her 20s. She is a practicing nun. And, she also lives in New York City. She works at the library and is very meek, very meager and quiet. And she is also finding herself sort of questioning her faith. She has a roommate that's very, open about her sexuality, how many partners she has, and things like that. So very much complete opposite of how Carol herself is. And that sort of makes her question, again, her faith. Am I living life the way I really want to, that I should be? Is this path with God really what I want? So, as we get introduced to her, then we get our antagonist of the story, Rosie. He's this old man who essentially is, he comes off very, very aloof. He's very friendly, very kind, and plays off that, I'm a fragile old man kind of thing. I'm lonely, I'm just looking for friends kind of thing. But all the while, he's sort of setting in this motion of what, that boy at the beginning of the prologue was. I should have mentioned that there's now a time skip. It's now obviously 1980 when the story's taking place. So Rosie's sort of throwing in starting the cogs in the machine of the ceremonies that needs to happen. So I really enjoy Rosie's character because he plays off being, this snake in the grass very well. It adds this layer of dread because we know who he is, but the characters don't. And he plays it off very well. And in the way he connects the dots, so Jeremy meets Carol, and then in all of this, it's very interesting. So, so Carol and Jeremy meet, and they quickly build a relationship. Jeremy offers Carol to come stay with him the weekend at the Porth's farm and all of that. So Carol agrees. She goes to the farm, and that's when things really start to get interesting, because all of them have this very interesting chemistry. There's a scene prior where Jeremy goes back to New York for a bit, and as Sarah is driving him, he doesn't go back to New York. He's going to the town with Sar, and as he's driving into town, he happens to notice Deborah on the porch. The sunlight just so happens to be hitting her to where her very her Amish dress, I guess I could say, happens to be getting see-through, and he notices she's not wearing anything underneath. So that right there just adds this element, like I said, of excitement to the story, where you're not quite sure if the Porths, again, are yet antagonists or protagonists. But that also leads to, like I said, more this interesting chemistry when they all finally meet. The Porths, Sar, Deborah, Jeremy, and Carol. You can tell Carol's very attracted to Sar's character. He's very muscular and tall, whereas Jeremy is someone who's very out of shape, very self-conscious, and, is not as, I guess, manly as Sar is, where, as I said, Carol's very, withdrawn, conservative, in her sexuality and her escapades. She's still a virgin. She is still a virgin. So, whereas you have Deborah, who's, not so much afraid to show her flirty side and her fun side, which is very exciting and inviting to Jeremy as well. So it's interesting to see them have this dynamic all throughout the house, and see them play off of each other. It really builds a lot of fun to it. Eventually, we get to start this scene where the Porth's cats are introduced. They're sort of characters in and of themselves. They have 9 cats. And there's this one cat named Wada. She's the oldest of the cats, very mean, and, except to Sar. And, we get Wada's backstory, which is awesome. I love that, I love when authors make animals incredible characters in stories, not just, a pet or a sidekick or this emotional attachment, but their own characters of themselves. So, it was really like not even just Wada, every other cat, has names, personalities, but is not as fleshed out as Wada. But anyway, eventually, Wada gets possessed by the beast in the woods, and Rosie is able to now telepathically control Wada through the beast. He's able to see what the beast is doing through Wada's eyes. And that's when things start to ramp up, and we get introduced to essentially our final character, Sar's mother, Mrs. Porth. She's a very heavily religious woman, very stern, very rooted in her faith, but she's also sort of the yin to Rosie's yang. She is also very aware of the ceremonies and what's going on. She's the one that's supposed to stop it all. And so when, the Porths start to notice Wada's bizarre behavior and everything, Sar starts to speak to his mom, and she tells him, this is what's happening. I know what's going on. And so yeah, like I said, we get some very interesting scenes with Wada and the cat and everything like that. And then unfortunately we start to hit a lull. Carol goes back to New York, and we get a lot of time with her and Rosie, sort of. We get time with her and Rosie as Rosie starts to get more steps in place. These are certain rituals that need to happen for the ceremony to be able to take place. So we get Rosie and Carol going to the fair. Rosie takes her on a picnic, and like, it really slows the pace down of the book. And I feel like such a hypocrite saying that, because the book very much reminds me of the movie Midsommar. And I hated that movie because I feel like the movie constantly threw in new rules, new things that couldn't happen because it was against the community's rules. And to me, it felt like, excuse me, to me, it felt like plot convenience. Like, oh, crap, we forgot about this. So here's a new rule that we didn't mention the first hour and a half of this movie. And it just made me hate it. I was just like, that you're just filling in plot holes because you realized it too late in the movie. Whereas with this, it takes away from the pacing. Like I said, while it's interesting to get it more up front, it takes away from the pacing because it's like, again, I appreciate the detail and seeing how complex the ceremony is, but at the same time, I don't personally find Carol interesting enough of a character to be so invested in her story arc for so many pages in a row. To me personally, I think had they kept Rosie and Carol on the Porth's farm and had rituals done there, it would have been much more interesting, because we could have still played on the dynamic of, Jeremy and Deborah absolutely having this, more than flirtatious relationship, walking that fine line of, his sexual frustration with, sort of her flirtatious personality, while also, we could have involved Sar in some of the rituals, and having Carol and his relationship start to bud, and have Sar maybe kind of question, have I made the right choice marrying Deborah with, her not being so steeped in faith as I am, whereas Carol is. I think that would have been a much more interesting concept and would have made the pacing even better throughout the story, rather than sort of having this lull within that's where it was like, okay, where's Jeremy and the Porths? But we do eventually bounce back. It does bounce back and forth. We get journal entries from Jeremy, and you know how much I love that. Like, that instantly gets me hooked. So it was interesting to get yet another point of view throughout the story where, we're being narrated to, but we also get Jeremy's inside thoughts as well. So I really love that. So as Rosie essentially completes the rituals and the ceremony is starting to, get to the day where it needs to be, we start to see the community fall apart with really interesting sort of rituals within themselves. The community comes to the poorest house and does this cleansing where they completely empty the house. We're talking picture frames, furniture, the stove, anything that's not nailed down is brought into the backyard and prayed over. And, Jeremy is being looked at as sort of the catalyst as to what's going on because he's an outsider. He's from the city, the land of sin. And, so things that are going on is, chickens are laying jelly-like eggs, and there's a woman that's pregnant that's, the pregnancy's going horribly for her and eventually she gives birth to this almost half chicken, half human thing. And Jeremy gets blamed for that because he touches her stomach at one point during that ceremony. And, cows are producing sour milk. There's snakes in the cornfields and everything. So things are just going beyond chaotic within the community, and everyone believes it's the end of days. So essentially we come to the climax of the story where, Rosie ends up drugging Jeremy and Carol, and, he starts to put in motion what needs to happen to reincarnate the beast. And the climax is great. However, I think it could have been better because Sar's mother is presented as such a pivotal character throughout the entire story. She's the one that first, sort of cracks that sort of what's going on is that Rosie is now putting into motion the rituals. And, she's the one that captures Wada and is able to determine that Wada is possessed. All of these things lead back to her, but, we kind of get what happens to her, but I think it's such a shoved under the rug thing that it really not only kind of, brings down the importance of her character, but I think it also kind of puts a damper on the climax a bit, because what happens with Rosie in the climax is fantastic. I love it. It is awesome. But I think what could have happened is if Sar's mother was sort of fulfilled her role into preventing the ceremony from happening, where, her and Rosie are locked in this battle against each other. I'll give a little bit of the climax. Rosie gets locked in this shed that's very, there's a lot of foreshadowing as to what happens inside this shed during that moment. And I think had Sar's mother been locked in there as well, like I said, I think that would have not only fulfilled her sort of martyrdom role within this story, it could have just brought the climax even more like, oh man, wow. But like I said, I think that genuinely just puts a damper on her character, and as we get to the actual ceremony, as it's can it be stopped? Can it not? I couldn't help but think, where was Sar's mother in all of this? But yeah, essentially the story comes to a nice end, almost an ominous end in a way that I really enjoy. It ties everything up, but is in that very classic 80s horror way of, is everything tied up? It leaves it open to, like I said, a sequel could happen, but not to the point where it's just like, okay, we never got that sequel that needed to happen. But yeah, so overall, I'm going to give the Ceremonies definitely a 4 out of 5. I think it's a wonderful summer read. The chapters are, like I said, told by dates, so it really adds a nice level of immersion to the story. it was kind of cool as I was reading along. It was like, oh, July 22nd. It was like, oh, cool, that's where I am in the book. So this could be happening somewhere out in the world I don't know. I mean, obviously not, but it's fun to think, Yeah, wonderful characters, beautiful prose, an excellent atmosphere, great storytelling overall. A bit of a damper on the pacing, I think. And like I said, nearing the end of the story, I definitely think Sar's mother kind of got shafted in her character. And I also think Carol could have been done better as our heroine of the story. I felt she was a little too wishy-washy, too meager, and just didn't... And that was her character. She was a quiet character struggling to find her voice, which I just don't think was done really well. But yeah. What did I take away from the story? Well, I guess, a lot of times we can feel like the place that we live in is... We can get tired of it, We crave excitement and we feel like there's more out there in the world. And, I can relate a lot to Jeremy being a city guy that's moved into a countryside, I grew up in a city where, my high school my graduating class was 1,000 people. And, you could go out and get a taco or a hamburger at 12 a.m. if you wanted. And there was always so much to do and see. And there was this huge hodgepodge of so many cultures. So coming here to a quieter place was very much a culture shock. But, as my time has gone on, I've learned to call this place home. But it doesn't mean I don't miss where I came from as well. And, we get that a lot from Jeremy, where he jumps back and forth to, I love it here, it's quiet, it's different. But at the same time, you get kind of homesick. So I think you just, learn to love where you live. I know everywhere's going to have its bad sides. It's, there's unfortunate things everywhere. And you just have to try hard to focus more on the positive that's around you rather than the negative. But that's going to be it for me today, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. If you've made it this far, even if you haven't, thank you for giving me even a little bit of your time. And until the next time, be nice to yourselves. Later, everyone.